Hi, welcome to your Benedictine Care Chapter 4 study companion video. Today we get to go into another big chapter together, which I'm really excited about. In Chapter 3, we were talking and you've been practicing stability of heart. And today we get to go into a really important topic, which is stability of faith and trusting the void. So, in that introduction to chapter 3, I shared a bit about my history with how I was introduced to centering prayer and contemplative practices, and how that was really just became such an essential part to my own spiritual formation. I mentioned at that time too that there were additional practices and that there was additional things that have since been introduced that really complemented my own spiritual experience and spiritual formation. Every individual is going to have different practices and different things that are introduced, different invitations that are extended based on their own personal journeys. But today we're going to go into a deeper one in the biospiritual focusing that I was introduced to by Sister Virginia at St. Paul's Monastery several years ago. And it became a beautiful complement to the centering prayer practice and to the contemplative practice where we just rest in silence. And our biospiritual focusing gives us another way to process what or listen to what we have the messages within our body and within our thoughts that we've been introducing. When we say listen to them, listen to our advocates or nurture our advocates and listen to our lighter voices, it's biospiritual focusing gives us an actual practice of how to, what does that listening feel like? What is that experience like? Because we don't just hear it like we do my voice speaking now. We don't hear it just through auditory words. We listen and we hear more through subtle impulses or through subtle feelings and felt senses within our bodies. And so we actually have a practice where we can cultivate that. We can cultivate that listening. And it becomes really just a powerful complement and important practice to continue to help us move and do that transformative behavior change rather than just substituting a behavior. It gives us a place of how to move through and with our established patterns rather than just substituting them and continuing to avoid the distressing emotion underneath. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm excited to go into detail about this with you. So, as we've done in the other study companions, let's quickly recap where we're coming from so that we can get grounded and know where we're moving and how we're building onto with this current chapter. So in chapter 1, Stability of Intention, we introduce the challenge of our current health paradigm, which tells us that first we must control, we must juggle, and we must control all of these to-do lists and control all of these balls. Then, if we do that successfully, every day, every week, every month, every year, if we do that successfully, then we will get to the results that we want. Well, we talked about what's happening is that we aren't able, it's setting us up for an impossible situation in which we're not going to always be able to control all of them. And it's left us in this pattern of continually feeling like we haven't gotten to the result that we want yet. So this experience that we introduced in chapter 1 with our practice of turning towards was what could happen if we start shifting our attention to the divine in the most ordinary lifestyle choices? What if this connection that has always been there, but we have forgotten about it? What if we shift our attention back to that, increase our receptivity to that connection? And what if that became our true source of healing and strength for our transformative behavior changes that we're seeking? So chapter 2, in stability of voice, we discussed the experience that starting to stand in our sacred sliver of space, when we started to turn and when we started to disrupt the automatic patterns, what is the challenge that's introduced when we start doing that? We introduce that there are a lot of voices that you start hearing once you actually shift your attention. You probably heard them before, but when you try to kind of pay attention to differences between them, we are really suddenly aware of just how many voices that there are. And hearing those different voices and hearing them be at conflict or have rubs between the different wants and desires, we realize that we don't have as much trust in ourself as we thought. We can feel that disconnection between what we do and what we really want in our heart of hearts, and that can be really confusing and produce anxiety within us. So the experience with chapter 2 is, if we have some reverence and if we bring these advocates forward, this human vulnerability that we all share, not one individual doesn't experience this. If we brought them forward, how could that actually help us move through that transformative change again, rather than just skipping over it and continuing to repeat those default patterns? So chapter 2, we introduce this idea of next, of just one more thing. What is the next thing to do? Just that one thing to do next. And how if we start framing that as more of a dance with the divine than an arduous must do list, even if it's I must do this one thing next, I must do this one thing next, we can still perpetuate that I have to do this one thing first before, and our list just becomes, you know, linear on the ground instead of the balls up in the air. And that is still reinforcing this I must control. So with our next, we want to keep that fluidity, that next, in the sense of we can let those balls down, we can let those to-do lists down, and just we will be presented with the one thing to do next. So we are excited about the momentum that we're having in disrupting. We've been doing these practices and increasing this awareness so that we can observe those very patterns that we're trying to change, because just by observing them, we actually start disrupting them. And once we disrupt them and understand how they formed, we can use that same process and we can utilize that space to actually start creating a new pattern by consistently doing our new behavior, and use the magnificent knowledge and capability of our mind to reinforce a pattern. We can just now, if we disrupt the old ones, we can actually have it reinforce a new one. In chapter 2, introduce that notice and nurture. So we built on our turning toward, and when we turned toward and started discerning those different voices, we would notice them, not try to change what we were noticing, but we would, when we heard an advocate, we would start accepting that and start acknowledging its presence and listening for any potential or having that nurturing presence with how it was presenting itself. And the exciting thing is that this is biospiritual focusing. So the practice introduced that we're going to go in detail in chapter 4 is just going deeper into that. So you have already, since the very first page of Benedictine Care, you did your first biospiritual focusing pause. So take a deep breath and recognize the intention that you've had for these past few months. And now we're just going to build on that. There's not another thing you have to learn. There's not another thing you have to do. It's just next. We're going to take this practice into next. So in chapter 3, We talked more about as we continue to try to turn and shift our attention when we're up in our mind, what is that actually feeling like? We saw how instability of heart, how small that sacred sliver of space really is. We realize how powerful those shadow voices can be, and that they surprisingly act directly against our true intentions. We saw how that clearly shows this potential for that divine help in giving that grace and those gifts and being receptive to that being a source, this penetrating love. When we say the divine, this penetrating love that can help us untangle those voices. So we began to move from our mind down into our heart of hearts. We introduced that 1,000-pound door, our mind, those automatic thought patterns that slam shut, and that it feels unreasonable to think we're ever going to be able to get our foot in there, let alone get to go behind it and control that door in the sense of it not just slamming shut and we're helpless, but that we can actually start softening that and move behind it, which is down into our heart of hearts. The practice that we introduced was centering prayer. And again, you're encouraged, if there were other contemplative practices, you are encouraged to bring that forward. And this, importantly, of how chapter 3 is going to be different from what we're talking about in chapter 4, is that what we're talking about today and moving forward into chapter 4 with our full bio-spiritual focusing practice, it does not replace our centering prayer or our contemplative practice, that bonding time, that dedicated time each day where we spend just resting and nurturing that relationship with the divine in silence. When we had a thought, we would come back to that intention to be resting in our heart of hearts and not let the mind and the 1,000-pound door take us. We would just gently return through the introduction of that sacred word. We would sink back down and prioritize that bonding time within our heart of hearts. And so that is its beautifulness, and we're going to keep nurturing that practice. Today is going to be a different way that we can, a complementary way of how we are going to continue to nurture in dedicated time now, rather than just bonding with the divine. We're actually going to go into more detail on how we nurture those advocates while being embraced with the divine. So they're just lovely complements of really allowing us to continue to, again, be able to move into that transformative change and into that growth, rather than simply substituting temporarily or trying to control. Okay, so how has the experience been of doing your contemplative practice and centering prayer? So it's very different from our chapter 1 and 2, where it was in the moment. And again, we bring that forward because that real time turning towards that game time application is significant. That's where the rubber really hits the road in the actual choices, those lifestyle choices that we make multiple times a day, every week, every month, every year. So that turning towards is, as we've said in Benedictine Care, all of our practices come down to how do we increase that space and time to be able to have more movement and more opportunity to do things differently within that space. So when we started doing our dedicated time, where we actually sat for 20 minutes, 1 to 2 times a day, most days, if not all days, what was that experience like? Moving from just the immediacy of hearing the voices in the sacred sliver of space real time, to what did it start feeling like when you would actually sit there for 20 minutes? With the direction to not try to change them, or to not do anything except be receptive and have intention and consent to be with the divine. So that's what chapter 4 challenges introduce is what was it like for you when you started sitting there for 20 minutes at a time? This is when we can surprisingly, some of the challenging experience within that is that we can realize that we feel miles away from our heart of hearts. We can we can read about the benefits of contemplative practice. We can get excited about what that is leading us to and what the fruits of those experiences are. But when we sit to do it, as comforting as it seems like it will be, it can be really surprising when we sit there and how we aren't able to feel that connection to our heart of hearts. And I want to assure you that that is a very expected part of the experience. Again, if you didn't have that and if you just felt completely in union with the divine and had that enlightenment, I don't know that you would, um, I don't know that you would have need for Benedictine care. Um, it's just that we are in our human condition, we are going to feel miles away, and that's the very premise of our spiritual practices is how can we shift and remember so that we feel that connection. That's the very opportunity that we're exploring together, and that regardless of your age or histories with spirituality, we can all be vulnerable to feeling that disconnection. Also, when you started sitting for 20 minutes at a time, did you feel like you were actually giving your shadow voices and your advocates a megaphone? That instead of quieting them, now they felt like they had center stage. So did you feel like you were at this play and you're now sitting in the audience and all the actors are up on stage and they're just kind of starting to bombard you with baseballs that are like flying at you? Like in your head, you just feel like there's this bombardment of baseballs flying at you. And when you started trusting that invitation to begin a contemplative practice, when you did that, when you took that step to go into next, has it felt more like you have stepped into an empty and barren space versus open and full of movement and optimism? Like, does it feel more empty and void than open? In chapter 4, we start looking at as well is that if now we're saying that having that connection and that ability to hear our lighter voice, like that is where this strength and guidance comes from for transformative change. But if I can't hear that yet, if even if I believe that that will come over time, I'm a functioning adult that I need to get things done today. I don't have the time to allow a process to take years to manifest. That's why I have juggled balls, and that's why I've tried to control them, is because even if it's leads me to these feelings of failure and these feelings of restriction, it has proven as a way to temporarily get the things done that I need to get done. So now if we're saying that way isn't sustainable, so put those balls down, has there been anxiety about, but I don't hear that lighter voice yet. I don't hear how to go just one step next. And is that leading to feelings of doubt or even stronger feeling that you want to pick up those balls again and regain that sense of control, because at least you got the temporary results and you felt like you could move forward each day. So we're going to validate that. We're going to validate all of this. We're going to validate how uncomfortable it feels to try to do things differently. When we really start doing that consistently, there's a reason that we do default patterns. And when we try to disrupt them, we can be faced with our own kind of disbelief that it feels too uncomfortable to do it differently, even though that's what we know that we want. We want to validate this experience and move through it together in chapter 4 and introduce some new ways of meeting it. So, as we talked about in chapter 3, we were first introduced to our 1,000-pound door. And this 1,000-pound door is so heavy and so loud, and it so slams shut right in front of us. Like we can feel the wind and the air from it slamming shut. And it feels like this concrete slab that we aren't going to be able to get behind, around, or through. So in chapter 4, one of the sections is we start talking about how do we dismantle this 1,000-pound door. And this is one of the important, with the challenges from sitting in those dedicated times of centering prayer. When we look at, I want to spend a minute like going through when we do contemplative practices of what has been happening in your 20-minute sits with this 1,000-pound door. So right when you first get started, this door that slams shut with automatic patterns, as I mentioned, can feel like concrete, like it's just an immovable slab that slams in front of you. And now that you've been sitting in those 20 minutes and you can feel that bombardment of thoughts from the advocates as you're sitting there, those thoughts, those baseballs that they feel like they're hurling at you as you sit there, those thoughts are what make up this 1,000-pound door. So it's this collection, this tight collection of thoughts that actually create our 1,000-pound door, that creates our automatic default patterns. So this is really exciting, because if we have this awareness now that it's not concrete, that it isn't completely impermeable, and we start looking closer at it, if we start observing it, when we're in our 20-minute contemplative sits, we can actually see how it isn't concrete, it isn't cement. At first, it feels like it's made up of many, many baseballs. So all of these thoughts that are coming, they're baseballs. But this is exciting because it means it is permeable. It means there is space in between. And it means that we can dismantle and continue to soften that door again so that we can move behind it and down into our heart of hearts. And that's exactly what you're doing in your contemplative practice, is you are starting to create that space and that ability to observe that, oh, this isn't impermeable. It's actually very permeable. It's made up of these individual thoughts that feel like baseballs. But in chapter 4, we get to think about this even more. And the more that we sit with them in contemplative practice, the more that we have the experience and we think, are these really baseballs? Or with the help of the divine and this divine therapy and this untangling that we talk about as happening during our contemplative practice, if we actually continue to watch, what that contemplative practice is doing is giving us even greater transparency. And we start seeing that this door is actually not even made up of baseballs. That our contemplative practices and our shifting our attention back to the divine gives us this amazing gift to start feeling that our thoughts are no longer outside of our control as a 1,000-pound collective that slams shut. They're also not even baseballs that have this intensity and that have this ability to dominate or this ability to control us like they have in the past. But when we're sitting in our heart of hearts and we start observing and we start increasing that transparency of what these thoughts are really like, we actually keep softening them to go from baseballs to bubbles. And as we get more and more consistent with our contemplative practices and with our shifting that attention, our thoughts continue to get softer and more transparent and more space between them. So we went from concrete and cement to baseballs to bubbles and to more space until we hit the true fruit of our contemplative practice, which is to allow us to feel our thoughts as more curious bubbles that will all have different shapes, and if they burst, it's okay. But that we have this softness and this ability to not feel like we have to stand on guard against them. Like when we're doing our contemplative practice, it is not the time for us, like the practice is not to just feel like we have a baseball bat and that during our 20-minute sits that we're sitting there just hitting these baseballs with a baseball bat, and that we have to keep them away and we have to keep them away from our mind, or away from us, from hurting us. But rather, contemplative practices are about dropping the baseball bat and standing in trust that if you stand within the baseballs and just let them go by, that's how they transform from baseballs to bubbles. That's how they soften, and that's how they lose that domination. Thomas Keating's book for the Introduction to Centering Prayer is Open Mind and Open Heart. And often we want the open heart as the fruit of the practice, but such an important part of that title is open mind. Open mind. Of letting those go and being soft. And as this image shows, that becomes external to us as well, where external circumstances aren't baseballs being thrown at us either. Like we can just soften the external situation and increase our perspective. And again, shifting that attention to the divine. Wow, what kind of flexibility and adaptation and alignment we can have in this reality, this softness versus only being in our minds with that concrete door and with those baseballs, but going into our heart where they soften and become bubbles that we can stand among and move around life with. So that takes us from, as I introduced in the beginning, this sense of it feeling empty when we walk into that sacred sliver of space, when we take that step into next, how it can go from feeling like an empty void to feeling like it's an open opportunity, that it's an enlarged space for us to align what we really want in our heart of hearts with what we really do. And so this, going back to one of the other challenges that we introduced, is this is taking that deep breath. We talked about, well, if this is how transformative behavior happens, but I have to function today, how am I going to move forward? How am I going to move forward from that void when it's still going to take time for those thoughts to feel like bubbles? Because that doesn't happen instantaneously. It is going to take time and consistency with the practice. So that is where we are going. So until we get there where it feels open and bubbles and we can smile, like today doesn't feel like bubbles. So what do we do? If we don't juggle, if we don't try to control, what do we do if we put those balls down? And the only recommendation can be is to practice the trust that if you put them down, that the resources will be provided to know what to do next. And that is practicing that stability of faith. It is practicing trust. Faith is trust. Faith is taking the risk until trust is established. So it's actually taking the risk that if you put them down and shift to the divine and nurture this relationship, dropping and bonding into your heart of hearts, it's taking the risk that you will have a new experience. And it's taking that risk until trust is established. And doing that consistently is our stability of faith. And a way to help reframe as you're thinking of this is the image that comes in mind for me is rather than our juggler that we introduced in chapter 1, if we put those balls down, what if we reframe thinking of what to do in our imagery and in our within the chapters of us talking about next, why the present moment is so important, is because we can just feel that nudge for next. So in chapter 4, the image that came thinking about that is rather than a juggler, what if we thought of contemplative action as more like a focused bowler, where in bowling you just have the one ball, you pick up the one ball for that moment. You do the best that you can. The pins fall as they may, but they are reset and the next ball is given to you. In bowling, you are just allowed to wait in the alley. There are other mechanisms that actually reset the pins, that actually present the next ball to you. And from there, you select that ball. You can now assess what is the best next course of action based on how the pins are now configured. And you just take your next ball and your next movement, and we move just frame by frame through our day, just moment by moment, frame by frame, next to next, in this dance, versus feeling like an exhausted juggler that cannot sustain the amount of to-dos that we feel are required before we get the result that we want. So as we are getting to this, the place that you are at today is you are in between. You are standing in between your lighter voice and your advocates. You have awareness for them, but you are standing in that discomfort of being in between them. But this is the very opportunity that you are ready and invited to move into. And so when we're in this space, we want to remember the biggest question that we are given in this space is choosing whether we are going to select familiar over faith. So when we're in these moments, we're standing in between. Who do we turn towards? It makes all of the difference. Do we turn towards the advocates and continue to let them lead? Or do we turn towards our lighter voice and let them lead? And when we start realizing that it comes down to this rather simplicity of this choice of familiar, which is the way of the advocates, over faith, which is the way of establishing a new relationship and establishing new trust through those experiences with the lighter voice, that we can really realize and be confronted with the distrust and the history of our experiences of spirituality that can actually really make us feel distrust towards our lighter voices in the divine. And that is going to be a real reality to wrestle with. We talk about that in chapter 4 of, most with spiritual histories, we are told that trust is earned with people, but that we are just supposed to trust God. And that disconnect in forming relationship, that kept God and the divine as this external entity that we had to be unquestioningly loyal to and be a conditioned way. Like many of us were taught that we were only acceptable if we were a particular way. And sometimes and often that might have been different than actually what we felt inside. And so doesn't that sound familiar from chapter 2 when we talk about, when Dr. Gabor Mate mentions that anytime you were in a position to feel like you had to be different to be accepted or loved, you experienced trauma. And unfortunately, many of our spiritual history with the humans that, with all of our limitations that are put in place as translators, reinforced that very dynamic onto God, where it made many feel that they had to be different than themselves. They had to choose between being themselves or being loved and accepted by God. And that is a really, really important realization to have for individuals, is that if that was their experience, and now we are saying that turn towards the divine, shift our attentions back in the ordinariness of life and trust that strength, but we have the very dynamic with them of feeling that that love was conditional. In many regards, many of our advocates could actually have formed by our spiritual history. And what a reality to untangle when we know that there is that big love that we talked about in chapter 3, that big love that is bigger than anything we could experience, but that for some, they have felt excluded from that, but yet believe in their heart of hearts that it is possible. And now as we start nurturing and spending bonding time and one-on-one time with this relationship, that anger and that hurt over feeling that that love was conditional is going to manifest itself just as it would in any other human relationship. And it's fair for the individual to have that experience. What is also fair is to now allow, with our matured resources, is to allow the divine to show you new experiences and to allow you to earn their trust. And that's our part, is recognizing it, but having that faith, taking that risk that those were limitations of humans and not God in our experience. And that relationship was ruptured with the divine as a consequence. But how can we now repair that? And how can we strengthen it and take the risk to establish trust to have new experiences? And that's big. That is just really big. And so when we say have faith, what we're really asking is just to take the risk to practice your stability of heart and your stability of voice and your stability of intention to permit a new experience, led from and embraced by that penetrating love of the divine, allowing yourself to feel that, to then want to, when you're in between, to not be afraid of actually turning to your lighter voice, of trusting them and having a strong relationship with them to be able to consistently turn towards, which will determine and influence everything. That's a big place to be in. So the practice that is introduced in chapter 4 to help us start letting our advocates be angry and finally not telling them that they have to be quiet, but that we can accept them and that the divine can accept them, does accept them unconditionally, giving them a new experience. That's what we introduce in our biospiritual focusing activity, in our practice. In the full one, we've been doing the biospiritual focusing pauses, and we've been doing notice and nurture. And now in chapter 4, we're going to know how, when I feel that, when I am in between my advocates and my lighter voice, and now my sacred sliver of space has enlarged and I can actually see both of them and see the direction each of them want me to take, how do I come to trust and get relief and get comfort by following my lighter voice? When you're in those moments, we now are going to introduce a practice that will allow you to be with that sensation. And this sensation will be felt for other things of when you feel your nervous system start getting those impulses and that intensity. We talk in the chapter about our advocates are constantly scanning our system for these impulses and for these messages. Like, these are our body. When we talk about embodied spirituality, these are the messages that our body is beginning to have for us. It's the ringing of the phone that is starting to say, we have something to tell you. There's a message here. And our advocates are constantly scanning for the ringing phones. They are constantly scanning and ready to jump in and say, I'll take care of it. I've got this. I'll take care of it. And so our opportunity is, rather than constantly then they take care of it, but then they're all riled up and they're all upset and they're all, getting all feisty. The real opportunity is to go with them and start not just trying to soothe them or regulate ourselves after we've already had the distress, but actually having a practice that allows us to go in and start sitting with and actually redoing the way that we interpret those impulses and those signals and listening for the message that's been behind them and starting having a safe way to be with that. And that's what we're going to go into in our chapter 4 biospiritual focusing activity or practice. And I am going to follow this video up with that guided practice. And I really encourage you, there are spiritual directors that are trained in biospiritual focusing. You can reach out to me to do biospiritual focusing. And there are therapists that are trained in focusing. That is what this work was based off from Genlin, from Peter Genlin. And so it's or Eugene Genlin, I'm sorry. But it's really a very powerful tool, and it is meant to be able to be done individually so that we can use that as this check-in, daily or multiple times a week when we start feeling these sensations that we have something to do with it. But as you're getting started, it can be really quite remarkable to do with someone to help them kind of guide and be with you and companion with you as you're listening. So, before you get to that, just I encourage you to go through the guided practice with me and just start being curious about it and start, you'll get that invitation. You'll know if that's something that you could benefit from or are ready to explore deeper. But until then, the self-guided practice is what all the practitioners that developed this was their hope, that this would be a practice that we could use in our own personal lives as a way to be with and actually finally hear the bigger messages where that divine manifests through our bodies and then we manifest that into the world. So, really cool, crazy, cool stuff that is fortunately been introduced to us that we can now benefit from to have them help us establish stability of faith, have ways that we can have new experiences with our spirituality and with the divine, and really embracing that love that maybe we thought we were excluded from. And also, even if we felt that love, feeling like it matters in those ordinary lifestyle choices. So it's just a beautiful way of continuing to integrate the divinity within the ordinariness of life. And that's where true transformation happens. So, thank you very much for your attention in this video. I hope you found it valuable. If you have additional comments for how I can continue to evolve videos or the content that you would like to hear or need that would be supportive, please let me know. I will happily accommodate requests that I'm able. And so until then, enjoy reading through the materials and finding those places that really speak to you and listen. Those are those nudges that we'll use in biospiritual focusing. So until then, thank you very much, and we'll talk again very soon. Bye-bye.